Okay, welcome. We're doing a new podcast series here. I'm here with Dr. Baron Short, and we'll be talking about the Mindedness Revolution. So welcome, folks. Welcome, Baron. And I'm super excited to get this podcast series off and running with you.
Happy to be here, Greg. We certainly have been talking about these issues for a little bit, and I think it was time to share it together and share it with the public and get more feedback from people and get them as stoked as we are about mindedness.
Amen. So everybody's heard probably of mindfulness, and we will be talking some about mindfulness. That's certainly sort of interface with our fields. You're a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist. That's got a lot of attention, but there's this other thing called mindedness that we are going to be introducing to the public and trying to explain why this is a super important context. So the Mindedness Revolution is about transforming the way we see the world in relationship to that. Before we get into exactly what that is, let's talk a little bit about our backgrounds. So we'll go with you, Baron. Tell us a little bit about where you come from and what you're interested in and what you do in the world.
Sure. So I like to stay busy. That's one thing, meaningfully busy. I'm trained in internal medicine and psychiatry and work at an academic medical center, and I'm the brain stimulation medical director for our university. So I'm heavily brained, if you will, in terms of training. And so I do things such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagus nerve stimulation, a whole host of modalities to change the brain in people that have been quite ill and not recovering from talk therapy or medications. I'm also a co-founder in a company called Zendo, where we have a consumer electronic used to stimulate the brain to enhance mindfulness effects, and we have studies on that. And so from one odd perspective would be, why would a brain guy be so interested in the mind, right? And I think you could argue several reasons why there's an interest there. The reductionist in me would love if it was just about the brain. And if I could just modulate the brain and have everyone recover into this beautiful state, I would do that. But that, quickly, as an expert in what I do, you start to see where people have a mind and have minded behavior, which we'll get into, and that brain stimulation alone will essentially get them into a place to work on their mind,
right,
but doesn't do the work for them, right? And I would also say we live in a time existentially. I particularly see this in the 20s, people in their 20s, early 30s, where there's this new existential angst that gets in, and we can get into this later in the podcast of, what is this going on? We may call it depression, anxiety, but it's so much more and related to culture and their justifications and their mind and how to work with their mind. And then lastly, I would just say my own existential. I was one of these critters, around 18 that had this profound existential crisis of like, what's the point? And is it to go to school, get a job, get married, have kids, get divorced, age, die? For some reason, said
so far, yeah.
There's got to be, but if you will, if that's a horizontal line, there's got to be some vertical dimension. At least that was my assumption. And over years, kind of exploring the mind from a bottom up and top down. So looking at how culture and different culture, traditional, modern, postmodern, how that changes, those justifications change your experience of being in the world, and a bottom up, right? So I got into kind of a pre-Big History 2.0, writing in college, thought theory of model of evolution and complexity, and walking through the stack, which we will be doing. So anyway, for kind of a little long-winded here, but we clearly had, a mutual shared interest and a true brotherhood from my experience, coming together on this. And so that's, those are some of the, how we got here and why I'm interested And I would, as we'll get into, I think we, as a society, as a civilization, suffer from a type of mind blindness that we're all plagued. And so part of it is to kind of deconstruct in aspects of what we're doing in society and how it could be different or what's wrong,
Yep.
perhaps,
Totally.
but also a reconstruction to say how
Totally.
could we make it better, right? And in a evidence-based, empirical-based, inspirational way to say we can do better together. So let's do that. So.
Amen. That's beautiful. And so as I think, if we put this on the UTOK channel, people will more or less know where I'm coming from, but I'll just say very quickly, obviously I'm a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology, theoretical clinical work. Like my journey starts with the psychotherapy world. And basically the short version is, why don't we have a science of human psychology that informs us rather than all these different schools of thought? And then the answer to that is, well, because we don't actually. We don't have a science of psychology, it turns out. We have a multiplicity of findings in psychology that sort of cover this weird territory of behavior and mental process, right? And then somehow that connects to the brain, and maybe it reduces to the brain, or maybe it doesn't. But we can study all sorts of shit and then have all these findings and then say, okay, well, these are empirically supported. Of course, with the replication crisis, you're like, well, maybe not. Right. And whatever it is, and then we can battle, is it really kind of a natural science, this thing called psychology, or is it a social science? Is it behavioral, cognitive science? And I say all that because we'll be getting into this. But one of the beautiful things about this podcast that I'm super excited is the bridge really between psychology, clinical psychology, medicine, and psychiatry. And that is not a bridge that's always, built or traversed. I mean, really, these are, so for people that don't know, my training is in behavioral science methodology, statistics, and experimental methodological controls initially, and then how to apply that through stats, and then learning all of the basic theories associated with behavior, like the Freudian theory and behaviorist theory and the Rogerian, and then learning personality and social psychology and developmental. I had a class on neuroscience, right? I had a class on neuropsychopharmacology, those two classes, and that's basically it. What I learned from biology. Okay. You, on the other hand, friend, learned a little more about biology. So you're a medical doctor in psychiatry. Your grounding is in biology, physiology, anatomy, all the organ systems, the treating of it. That's to become a medical doctor. And then from there, you jump off and say, well, when does it go wrong and how do we fix that? Right? Me, I'm like, okay, basically, what are rats in labs doing? Oh, there's a thing called reinforcement and association. And then from there, let's see what people do. So that's just for people to know, outside of the disciplines, especially if you're thinking about getting treated in mental health, I see a psychologist, see a psychiatrist. Usually the psychiatrists, they prescribe drugs and psychologists don't, but actually folks should know the training is strikingly different. And really, although certainly like you and I can get along really well, the two disciplines actually are pretty far apart. I don't know if you have any comments on that. We'll get back into that. But one of the bridging aspects of this that I'm super excited about is the clinical psychology and psychiatry bridge.
Sure. A couple of comments off of that. So one would be in my own training. So while it's mostly biomedical training, as a psychiatrist, people do get some degree of psychotherapy training that can vary by institution. But I was one of those critters that was heavily immersed in psychodynamic therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, existential therapy, and perhaps no surprise, as a young resident, how does this stuff fit together? Like, how does, where was my Gregg back then, by the way, right? But I was just like, and even trying to put it together. And I guess at that time, the closest I had was more of an integral psychotherapeutic approach. And even right out of my training, while I was getting more and more into brain stimulation and functional MRI, was also interested in the psychotherapy and had been a participant in an integral psychotherapy study done by Dre Marquis.
Right.
We had like 50 recorded sessions, and they're coding each thing and trying to understand when we had 3 different integral psychotherapists, were we doing the same thing? And the answer was no, we were not. But it was part of the empirical approach to try to understand. And that was actually just as a connection. That's how we met through Dre.
So thank you, Dre. And actually, that's a nice segue, because we just produced the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration, the special issue that Dre edited, and came out on unification. Which is very apropos for this podcast, in the sense that they're starting to lay out, hey, maybe there is a way to sort of unify psychology down into biology and up into the social sciences, and then bridge it across to psychotherapy. One of the perspectives that's crucial is the integral perspective, because it brings the multiplicity of developmental lines, that's the lines, and the quadrants, the different perspectives that are brought to bear, the subjective, collective intersubjective, specific objective, and collective objective. Those are the quadrants. And one of the beautiful things that Wilber does for big picture thinkers is like, there are different frames of reference, right? We're going to be coming to this, especially the objective versus subjective frame, or interior versus exterior frame. This epistemological difference is unbelievably huge if we're going to be dealing with mind relative to matter. There's also this ontological issue, but the Wilber perspective is absolutely central. And Andre Marquis brings it to answer this question of like, how do we think about the science of psychology from a philosophically sophisticated way? And that's super cool. And I appreciate our bridge through him. I'm always grateful that he hooked us up, because very quickly, once he did, we realized, holy shit, we should have been talking a long time ago. We're on parallel paths.
That's right. And in terms of the query, it said, what about the fields? I think in general, I would say my experience is psychiatry and psychology have a huge divide, where they tend to align with like the biomedical or the psychosocial. And then I don't know your experience, but even within psychology proper, as opposed to, say, someone getting clinical training as a master's in social work or something, there is this, my experience of it at least, is there's this need to justify that this is a real science, and people stay very focused on behavior. They're a little cautious, actually. If you talk about the difference in the traditions, cautious more about psychodynamic approaches, or, they want to make sure that everybody knows they're a behaviorist. Right. Which is a whole other comment of like, what is behavior, and is it just within the realm of psychology, or a whole stack, right? So.
Right. Well, my argument basically is what the field did, at least the field proper. Obviously, the field's huge, and you have all these different, but the science proper, both at its inside of science and then as it's applied, is basically, well, we become a science because we apply the behavioral science methodology. And thus it's empirically informed. And that is what I learned I was a cognitive behavioral, in sort of behavioral tradition of cognitive behavioral thinking, because, we can specify through the research methods of behavioral science, and then we can justify, and that's way better than folk psychology or that psychoanalytic BS, right? That goes into, who knows about that stuff? And a lot of it sounds kind of crazy. You really do want to sleep with your mother? I don't think I did, dude. What are you talking about? Not that I was defensive about that. But anyway, yeah, so you have that within psychology, and then there's a whole raised on the EST movement. Aaron Beck, as people may know, I worked with him for 4 years. He's really one of the fathers and founders of aspects of that. It's an interesting history there. But so really, why is that? Folks should know. And that's going to get us, we're going to focus, on the back half of this, just so people know this is going to be a half an hour. We're going to try to keep it to that. So we're going to try to hit on. So there's a little introduction. Let's talk about what mindedness is very briefly, and then let's hit on some of the problems so that folks can. So we're coming at this as a psychiatrist. We're going to get into what Baron talks about in terms of the firmware, the brain firmware, mind-brain firmware. That's going to be super hot and interesting. And then we'll get in this whole mindedness concept. But right now, let's talk about mindedness and then the problem that it addresses. So mindedness is going to come out of UTOK, Unified Theory of Knowledge. And bridge actually also it warrants some connection with John Vervaeke's work, because actually the term actually evolves in the context of my conversations with him. So let's talk about this term for a little while. Next episode, we're going to be exploring the expanded worldview that UTOK gives us through the Tree of Knowledge. And that's extending just matter over here. Actually, no, it's a much more expanded view of energy, matter, life, mind, culture. But in that, it says, hey, there's this whole dimension in the world that we can observe between living organisms and cultured persons. And it's the dimension of minded animals. And what does that mean? It basically says that what happened in the world is that a nervous system, it coalesced in a brain, that they can move a body. Okay? My discipline calls that behavior, but that's dumb. Because behavior was happening before. Just ask anybody in plant biology or cell biology or even physics. Okay? Behavior was already happening. Okay? The question was, what kind of behavior? All right. But the behaviorists were just trying to say, hey, we can connect it to the natural sciences, both through the study of the world and through, because there has to be some sort of physical line. So they called it behavior. But people have to understand that behavior in psychology means two things. First, that connection, so that we don't get into flaky, mechanistic, mentalistic concepts. But also they do a sleight of hand, because then it becomes psychology's the science of behavior, which is different than what you biologists do. Right? So it's both continuous, but then flips over and becomes discontinuous without changing the word. Okay? So that's if you want just a nutshell of the error, it's that behavior is the continuity, but then there's a discontinuity, and we need to call it something. And we call it mindedness. Okay? So mindedness refers to the behavior of the animal as a whole, mediated by the nervous system and brain in particular, that allows for a complex active body to move around in a sensory motor loop that we can just see in terms of the way animals give rise to functional awareness and responsivity. Okay? So that's, in a nutshell, the concept of mindedness. It's the sensory motor loop through a complex active body and a brain that gives rise to the way animals act in and on the environment, showing functional awareness and responsivity. So, super important concept. I'll stop there, see if you want to jump in on any of that in relation.
Sure. So I'll use the example I've seen you use of a cat in the tree, right? And so you have a dead cat, a cat under anesthesia, and a minded cat, and you knock them out of the tree and you observe their behavior, right? And so the dead cat falls out of the tree. No dead cats, but let's just say that happens. You could open it up and there's not even a circulatory system or heart pumping or anything. Okay, so that's a material object at that point, right? The living behavior of a cat under anesthesia, you could actually open it up. Then you actually see a heart pumping. You see living behavior, but that system is actually better at the minded behavior, where that sensory motor loop is actuated and able to function in the world, and arguably it functions in the world to improve fitness, not veridical truth. And I think this is where that'll come up later, of just because we experience it doesn't make it accurate or useful. That's something that may come later, but it is there to improve fitness, hopefully. And that minded cat will land on its feet. And that's a very different behavior. And I think at current point, what you're emphasizing is we're still just talking about from essentially an objective behavioral standpoint, and we're extending behavior, say to the further down the stack, and we'll get more into this of the physics and living things. But also there are these animals with nervous systems that have a different type of behavior, and we can talk about what we see from an outside in, but because part of our own stack is that we too are minded animals that then will justify. There is a subjective epistemic that arguably, as human beings, we could explore. What is it like to actually be minded?
Totally.
And what is it like to examine one's mindedness And are there examples of doing that in our fields of psychology and psychiatry, contemplative traditions? There's a lot of things where people, they may not language it that way, but they are exploring mindedness and justifications, and that changes experience, and arguably that changes minded behavior. So it's yeah. Go.
So that's unbelievably elegant. I just want to point out the elegance of that. And this is really where the Mindedness Revolution is all about, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So if we think about this in terms of physical, mechanical terms, which, by the way, John Watson did. Okay. He tried to eliminate consciousness and then said it couldn't fit into the scientific. That's not us at all. Okay. And what he did was he confused the exterior view, the outside in view, with what's called a physical reductionism. And those are two totally different things, okay? But John Watson, the early behaviorists, fused those together and said, oh, it's just behavior. But what he meant was both it's outside in and physics all the way down, so therefore consciousness is not necessary. But outside in is just an epistemological position, right? Mm-hmm. And when you think about it, you're observing shit. So the scientist is somehow conscious. So that better fit into the equation, right? And obviously I'm conscious. I don't think you're a zombie. We can narrate about this, but this whole issue of subjectivity is so central to our being. So the early behaviors get this completely wrong, even though we appreciate what they can give us, okay? But they get it completely wrong. So we're giving a totally new revolution into behavior on the one hand, and that it opens us up to get to subjectivity, self-conscious reflection, mindfulness. Consciousness is going to become unbelievably central to this whole conversation. So what you say there shows how easy with this little switch, we go from this big jump, this jump from, it's all physics that we can observe in an unfolding wave of matter, right? That then is, we have no idea how to put mind back in there. Actually, with the concept of mindedness, we go from outside science, natural science, outside. Oh, wait, that's where the inside comes. And oh, by the way, I'm an inside observer watching this thing. And that's what you just laid out. So, folks, that's what we're talking about here. This is a shift. And that sets us up. We can talk now a little bit about the problems that we are addressing here in our conversation. But anyway, I want to jump on that. I'll let you if there are any thoughts you wanted to round out there, and then we can talk about the problems that this mindedness revolution addresses.
That's great, Greg. I think probably what I would provoke our listeners, and at the end of this series, people can make their judgment about this, but I would argue what Greg and I and others are doing is we're trying to bring about a mindedness and justification revolution, and that this has the potential, and this is my bold speculative claim, that has the potential to be as revelatory as a Copernican revolution, where as soon as people were able at a cultural level to empirically examine a little bit further, right? Like we all can look, we see the sun rise, we see the sun fall. Culturally, we all said, okay, the sun must rotate around the earth. Great empirical argument, right? And then we built mathematics to support it. And we were just not as accurate as we thought, right? And so if we examine a little bit further, it's the exact opposite, right? So the earth is rotating around the sun. Sorry, our flat earthers. And I would argue, and we would argue, that as we start to understand mindedness as a behavior, how that can revolutionize our own fields, it can revolutionize our folk psychology, but it also revolutionizes our experience. Because now we're actually saying there is this feature of experience that we're calling mindedness. There's features that help construct its capacity, and also from a top-down, culturally constrain what our mindedness will be doing. But as we get all this online, it has the capacity to radically transform how we experience ourselves, how we look at, say, even our mindedness and our justifications, because we arguably are in a time where there's lots of justifications out there that people are confused about, right? How do I know this is accurate or not, accurate or useful? So
Right.
we'll get into some of that, but that was at least one of the follow-up statements, that this is arguably a revolution that has the capacity to be as profound as a Copernican revolution. That's
I
going to
love
be
that.
my claim, at least.
Yep. I love that, and so we'll end here with basically a brief description then of some of the problem. Okay, that I think. So in my analysis of this, I call this the Enlightenment Gap in terms of the problem, and the argument basically is that as science, in particular physics, took hold, and its capacity to mathematically map the unfolding of energy and matter. Basically, it became very difficult as that system grew in its power to put mind in the world and to clarify the relationship between our scientific understanding of the world and our subjective and social. So the Enlightenment Gap says, hey, there is matter in the world, there's mind at some kind, and there's an ontological question about meaning. When I say ontological, it's like your theory and map of reality. Like what are those things and how do they go together? Okay, that behavioral error is a great example of confusion on the ontology side. And it also says that actually we need to know the epistemology of science, meaning how does science, natural science into physics, understand the world? How does it justify what it claims to be? If it says Einstein's theory of relativity, how does it justify that? And how is that system of understanding related to our phenomenology, that subjective knowing? Like you open your eyes and you see shit. Like, what is that? How do we do that? And our stories, our justification, our culture tells us stuff. It's great to be an American. Is it? Oh, you mean North American? No, I mean like United States. Oh, well, wait. Isn't the whole Western Hemisphere American? Then ask my partner, Masi. It's like, well, actually, that's kind of arrogant. Okay? My point there is their culture system of justification, your phenomenology, and natural science. These are all different ways of knowing. How do you put them together? We haven't and don't have a clear understanding. So we lack an ontology that places mind in relationship to matter. We lack a coherent epistemology that places science in relationship to subjective and social knowing. That's the Enlightenment Gap. And at the center of this Enlightenment Gap is this mind blindness, this inability to see mind in the world. And that's caused a huge amount of confusion. And the Mindedness Revolution is allowing to see us, to fill in, to bridge and resolve this gap. And the revolution that causes, very similar to being on the earth and thinking that it's at the center of the earth, the universe, and realizing, oh, no, actually, it's rotating around the sun, which then nested inside a galaxy, which nested inside lots of other galaxies. It's a fundamental shift in our understanding.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Greg. This mind blindness is arguably pervasive, and one of the ways that I joke, semi-jokingly with some of the psychiatry residents I work with, I go, they may be in their fourth year or their last year of training. And I go, at some point in the conversation, I'll say something like, well, obviously you've been taught like what the mind is, right? Everyone in the field has been telling you, and they kind of look at me quizzically, no, I haven't, right? So, right. Not totally cut on our field, but like people are not trained in a metapsychology of what a mind could be. And so there is a risk that people get more and more just brain-based biochemical. And I think there is a backlash in our own field of that happening. But it actually goes the other way around, right? So we can have people seeking treatment, and they too can over-reduce to a brain and go, well, there's nothing I need to do. There's nothing I need to change in my experience or the way I think, feel, or relate, or even to own that that's a capacity.
Right.
That you could change your mind. Like, it's nothing I need to do. It's my brain. That said, it doesn't mean there aren't brain problems. That's my field. But it's not always the brain. The reductionist me wish it was, but it's not. And so it's important to say we're talking about an enlightenment gap and a philosophical perspective. The other thing I sometimes will catch is people go, well, I don't want to really get into philosophy. And I go, well, it's actually really important to implicit, because otherwise you're operating from implicit metrics of like what the framework, right? And so if you're not aware, you're still operating from it. So one of the things we'll be doing is fleshing out an ontology, what is a descriptive model or map of reality, and the epistemics. So how do I know what I know, and how do I justify these claims? And to actually say these are important things that actually can be eventually be very grounded in like life and death scenarios for people, and meaning, well-being, all these things. It matters. It becomes relevant, not just a heady theoretical thing. I just want to make sure.
Absolutely. And I'll flip it around on my side. In the behaviorist tradition, the cognitive tradition, there's often just gross ignorance about the neuroscience. So one of the things I like to say when you're thinking about activate frontal lobe, right? Activate frontal lobe fuses your psychological reflective structure with the realization that actually it's also necessary to be mediating that through your embodied nervous system and your action, and all of that is nested inside of a larger material world. We're not talking about magic here. This is what's called endonaturalism, and we can speculate about what's beyond that. But fundamentally, this is a sort of intensely scientific version of reality. It's one that's just done reduced to physicalism. It's a behavioral nesting that gives us inside out, outside in, and science and culture altogether. And that's what we'll be sharing. So I think we're kind of getting to be at time here. So let me just summarize some of the things that welcome. Hey, the Mindedness Revolution has begun in episode 1. And what we have, is a bridge, a surprising bridge, actually, or surprising how absent it often is, between psychiatry and psychology. What the heck is mind to psychiatry versus what it is in psychology? Quite different. Ask John Vervaeken. It will be different in anthropology. It will be different in philosophy of mind. It will be different in artificial intelligence. Why is all of that? Because there's an enlightenment gap, folks. There's a fundamental gap in our understanding of our ontology or an epistemology, and that's left us mind blind. This podcast is about filling that in so that we can see mind, see mindedness. It's really quite simple. It's that sensory motor loop in animals, allows them to get up and move around, so you can walk through the woods and see the squirrels and the birds and the bees, and they are behaving very differently. It's just the kind of behavior they do, and it's called minded behavior, and it's got the property of mindedness, and we're here to open your eyes to it and share. And that's what this podcast is about. It's a journey on doing that.
I think that's a beautiful summary, Greg. So yeah, we're
all right.
Happy to be doing this with you together, and look forward to more episodes together.
Amen, brother. It's a real joy. And thank you. And we're off. The revolution has begun.
That's it. Let's go.
Right. Let's go.